Again, thank you all so much for being here. And before we start, a big round of applause for Manthia Diawara. And Manthia, we're going to talk about the film, of course, foremost tonight, the film we've all just seen. We're also going to talk about what you're working on at the moment, about your AI research, about, as mentioned, about Angela Davis. But before that, I wanted to kind of begin with Edouard Glissant, because that is how we met 15 years ago. And Glissant thinking is today, in 2023, more urgent and more important than ever. Glissant gives us these amazing toolboxes, mondialité, the archipelago, creolization, the right to opacity, as he once told me, that every relation starts in opacity, that we have to admit that our identities depend on others. And of course, also in relation to the film, particularly important, Glissant as an activist of the environment, of the natural surroundings, describing places where the landscape, the vegetation, and the sea are actually characters which are as important as human beings. Can you tell us a little bit about Glissant as a toolbox for you, but also as a toolbox for this film?
Thank you. I'm, first of all, very happy to see such an audience for this program. And I have to thank really the PCAI group for coming to our rescue at a moment we needed most. The Kika, Atanasio, you all, I can finish thanking you. Thank you so much, and please give them a hand for giving this. Yes, thank you so much. And it's a wonderful movie theater too, and every time a filmmaker's dream is this, to show the film in a movie theater like this. So thank you for hosting us. I really appreciate it. But also Hans Ulrich, co-stars, my producer Jürgen. These are the people I work with. People think films are just one person's work. It's not, believe me. So it's a teamwork. So I really appreciate it. I'm really humbled. Thank you very much. Edouard Glissant, French Martinican poet, philosopher, came into my life much later, because growing up in Africa, we were taught how to think by reading Frantz Fanon, who is also a Martinican French writer who wrote books like Black Skin, White Mask, Les Damnés de la Terre, The Wretched of the Earth. So, who also says, il n'y a de culture que nationale. The only culture there is national culture. This is very challenging for us, because it is saying that African traditions and the spirits, all these are superstitions. Stand up, fight for your nation, and as you build your nation, you also build your culture. So this is the way I was trained. And Frantz Fanon and Edouard Glissant are 2 years apart. Fanon is 2 years older than Glissant. And they were all students of the Negritude movement, Senghor, Césaire, people like Léon Damas, Alioune Diop, and so on. And Glissant, on the contrary, came to my life much later, at a time when I was already a professor, because growing up in Africa, in France, before going to the United States, Glissant was almost a bad object, because he's not radical enough, he's not oppositional enough. So we stayed away from Glissant, and then I met Glissant in the US, and Glissant thought that a dangerous thing was to engage in oppositional ideas. I think he was as much against oppositional ideas, binary opposition. That's how we call it. You know, if I say black, you say white. He was as much against that as he was against the idea of transparency, because he was for opacity and he was for diversity. Ideas are not opposed. Ideas actually enter in relation, and as they enter in relation, they create new, unpredictable, unforeseen elements. This is Edouard Glissant that I met. So I began to read Glissant really after I became a professor. I was at University of Pennsylvania, and from there I went to New York in 1992, became professor there. That's when I became friends with Glissant, who basically think that we should go first against the French idea of je pense donc je suis. I think therefore I am. He said, il faut opposer l'étant à l'être. You have to oppose the becoming to the being. Becoming was the most important thing. You are always becoming. You are not. Because being is something fixed. So, once I began to read these ideas, I tell people that Fanon taught me how to think, but Edouard Glissant saved my life. So this is what I've been working with, really. Glissant's ideas and all his toolbox, and this film couldn't have existed without it. And many of my films that I made for Adam, for Documenta, again was inspired by Glissant, the Documenta that took place in Athens here. So yeah, I've been working with Glissant because he helps me to go beyond oppositional identities.
Yeah, that's so important, and that's also why I have this ritual to kind of read him every day. I begin my day every day with a reading of 15 minutes of Edouard Glissant, something I highly recommend. Now, an idea of Glissant which is less known, but which is very important for the film we all just saw, is of course this idea of a detour, of a detour, no? Mm-hmm. And quite at the beginning, actually, when we started to work on this project, you told us I'd been living in the US for 40 years and came back to Africa looking for a home. As you know, Edouard Glissant said, return is always a detour. After 40 years, home won't be the same. Detours are always contaminated, errant dreams. Glissant, you say, was very interested in detour rather than return. Can you tell us about that? Because that's essential, no, for this film. Yeah.
No, detours are very important. Both Glissant and myself, I was trained in the US in what is known as Black Studies, departments of Black Studies. This is really my background in the US. Black literature, Black sociology, and so on. This is US unique way of studying the world. Italian American, Greek Americans, Black American, and so on. So my training came from that. And it was, the 70s, the 80s, there were movements either of Afrocentricity or Black nationalism that wanted people to return to Africa. The DNA movement actually came from that. The most important person for the dissemination of DNA is an African American, Henry Louis Gates Jr. He's the one who interviewed everybody and they discovered their origins, their ancestors, and so on. So in a way, this return, le récit de retour, return to the origin, return to the identity, become very important to African Americans. But Glissant said, but once you leave home, you actually can't go back. You can't go back because as you go back, you are going back to something else, but you also are going back as a changed person. You're not going back as whatever that identity is. So it's this detour that is important to Glissant's work, and that he thought was more preferable to the DNA studies. He said, DNA will say, this is a caricature, he will say, you are my brother because the DNA said that we come from the same family. We all Mandingos or Zulus and so on. Glissant said, that's absurd. That's really absurd. You are brothers when you have the same kind of intuition toward the world. When you have the same kind of sensibility, you have the same kind of poetic vision of the world, then you become brothers. But to have this notion of that DNA trace my ancestry to Mali, to Nigeria, to other places, he said, it may even be true, but it can only lead us to the Hutus and the Tutsis. It can only lead us to eventually some kind of tribal war. Yeah. So the detour is very important, and detour is related, of course, to Glissant's relationship with Gilles Deleuze. They were very good friends, and Félix Guattari. And they believe in rhizomes. They believe in trees that grow up together and nurture one another, as opposed to trees that push their roots into the ground and kill everything around them. So identity, rooted identity was what Glissant was fighting against, and he was going to relational identity.
And that brings us also, of course, to the relational identity of the film, because in a way, this film has so much to do with relations, with interpersonal relations you build up. It's a very long-term project because you actually have built and you also continue to build, because this is ongoing. Yeah. The film doesn't end here.
Right.
It's an ongoing story, relationships with people in Yene, beyond actually what is spoken about. So it would be interesting if you talk a little bit about the encounters you have had for the film, and maybe also since then, and maybe to expand a bit on the narrative raised during the film. And interesting is also kind of where it begins and where it ends. How did you decide where the film begins and where it ends?
Mm-hmm. Well, so I'm from Mali. Mali and Senegal used to be called one country. At independence, it was called La Fédération du Mali. But eventually they split, one become Mali, one become Senegal. So it's the same culture. But I spent 50 years in the US. Went to school there, started teaching in Santa Barbara. From Santa Barbara, I went to UPenn. From UPenn, I went to NYU and so forth. So I'm a bourgeois African who made it, and therefore I have to have a vacation home. So, so it's the narrative that we all know. So, and I really believe this. I started looking for a house everywhere. I say, well, if you go to Mali, Malian tradition is mi casa tu casa. My house is everybody's house, and I'm a writer, and I like to think, I like to contemplate. I'm selfish, so I can't buy a house in Mali. So eventually I went someplace in Senegal on an island, not 55 kilometers from Dakar, to buy a house. I don't speak Wolof, I speak Soninke, Mandingo, a little bit of Pular and so on, but I don't speak Wolof. So I'm living with these people who said hello to each other. Then I'm also realizing that actually I don't know Africa as I pretend to know Africa when I'm in America, because I have left Africa. So how do I learn to relate to Africa in a new way through the eyes of the people in this place? This was quite important to me, to go beyond salam alaikum, alaikum salam, Diawara. I give them the last name. We say things, we're neighbors, but we really were not communicating. This became almost the subject of the film. How do I return to this place? You talk about D2 yourself. And as I began this enterprise, I think the film helped me to discover myself, in a sense that I usually, in many of my documentaries, by the way, Harry Belafonte passed today. I would like you to know that, because I made films on people like him, and so in many of these films, I'm a person trying to go back home. But what you realize is that whether we like it or not, I'm a Westerner. And Glissant also is this person who says that l'Occident, c'est un projet. The West is a project, it's not a geography. This was very important to Edouard Glissant. And this project has its critics in Africa, in India, but also in Greece and in France. So the critique of this project is what was important to Glissant. So I began to do this autocriticism, but with Western eyes. So how do I begin to learn to know Africa in a different way? This becomes really crucial to me at my age. I'll be 70 soon, in a few months. So I said to myself, how do I learn to talk to this woman who resembles my mother, my sisters, but yet I don't know them, and they're African? How do we begin to do this without condescending? This was the challenge of the film. And one of the things that Glissant became important in this, Glissant said, I don't do politics. And the problem with politics is that it's not poetic. Whatever you do, it has to be poetic. If you do philosophy, philosophy has to be poetics. Economics, they have to be poetics. Politics, they have to be poetics. And if they're not, he's not interested. But he will do politics for the environment. He said, this is the only area where I'm ready to fight for. And some of the reasons, the volcano in Martinique, the Mont Pelé, and the trembling of the earth and all these things. So in many ways, I thought that by studying the environment as a Westerner first, and then trying to see it from the eyes of the woman on the beach, then I was actually trying to learn about myself. I was learning about myself. This is why beginning, middle, and end begin to come together in the film.
Thank you. And it is indeed so interesting that Glissant often referred in terms of his politics to the environment. He called himself an activist of the environment or of the natural surroundings. Now, one thing which, of course, this question of the local and of the home also brings forward is this idea of being rooted. And both you and I had many conversations with Glissant on that, and he always said that being rooted in one's country, in one's city or village or culture,
local, yes,
in a local context, right, is important, but it's only important as long as it does not lead to the exclusion or even worse, to the annihilation of other people's roots, and as long as it doesn't lead to a hierarchy or an election of some roots over others. So that he basically asked for a celebration of roots that expand elsewhere, of roots that touch each other. So they're not singular roots, but they are roots that cover and protect. And that seems to be also very present, no, in the film.
It's very important because, Glissant says, agis dans ton lieu et pense avec le monde. Agis dans ton lieu et pense avec le monde. It's your local Athens, your neighborhood. I spent my 3 months at Exercias on Bubulina Street, something like that, when I was here. So your local is important, but you have to think with the world. Because Glissant believed that every small place on this planet had the power to change the world, to enrich the world. So your local is very important, but don't build walls around it. Use it to change the world. And I think the local in Yene was important to me in that sense. The local in Yene, in a sense that, the biggest irony is that when I was growing up in Mali, I was very afraid of nature and the environment. The sacredness of certain trees, the sacredness of certain bushes, nature was a character. I was afraid. But as I become westernized, I forget about all these things. They don't touch me anymore. So I go back to Yene and I begin to talk to people. A woman said to me, when maybe not long ago, 10 years ago, this was a forest where people come and did the sacrifice. to the gods. But now people have built their houses on all these places now. She said that. And then I began to remember my own childhood where, people really believed that the environment could speak to you. People understood the language of the wind. They understood the language of the fire. They understood the language of trees and what, certain kind of light at night. They understood the language. But I left all this. I began to relearn with the people in this place, basically. People who don't speak the same language, Wolof and Bambara or Mandingo or Jula, but the way they still relate to the environment began to teach me something, basically. Many of them said, when I was growing up, this village was 3 kilometers from the ocean. Now the ocean has come and destroyed all the places where they kept the sacred objects, the gods and different kind of things. It's all destroyed now. And immigrant that I am, I just say, the closer to the water in French, pied dans l'eau. I wanted to have my foot in the water, basically. I wanted to build my house someplace where I can just, it's kind of stupid in many ways. But they were laughing at me, but now we have become really good friends. We're supporting each other. So in that sense, I think, again, Glissant was very useful for me.
And then, of course, there is this notion of dignity, which I think is really key in the film, because when you kind of recount the exchanges to the pebble collector, you talk about dignity. Can you tell us maybe about somehow how you investigated this question of dignity?
Yeah, in the Wolof language, dignity is Jom, J-O-M. And it kind of, both in the city in Dakar, but especially in these rural areas, people relate to each other through the sense of dignity. They know the self-value through dignity, who you are, and these definitions, they will say to somebody like me, you do not know yourself. If you knew yourself, you wouldn't be behaving like this. This means that where you're coming from, where you're going, what kind of position you should take in society should actually tell you what to do. And what I see in the village is that people now are working jobs that have no dignity. They are working jobs that actually take the humanity away. A very good example is the character, the person in the film who said, when you throw the ball against something, it's gonna know that it's gonna bounce back at you. That is, if you throw something in the ocean, the ocean is gonna throw it back at you. That guy was very worried about the future of his children, Alu. He said, now instead of becoming fishermen, they have to become mechanics. They have to build houses for people like yourself. They have to learn jobs that people learn to work for modernity, for modernization, for industrialization. Now, right about the time I went to show the film in London at Serpentine, his son, who had graduated as a mechanic, woke up early in the morning, was going to work, had an accident and died. Something like that. So these things, they're both part of the conversation, but they're also part of reality that happened to people. They have lost one way of life, and they have not learned the other way of life in a kind of sustainable manner. And it can take that from that level all the way to my level. I read Greek literature, I read Roman literature, I read all kind of literatures, but at the expense of where knowledge and the sense of dignity was in my culture. So many Africans, people don't like to hear this, they grow up in the cities, and then they go to places, they say, I'm African. They actually have lost Africa, and they will never get that Africa that they're looking for, and including myself. So only thing I can do is learn another Africa through this woman that I'm living with now in the village. Learn a new Africa that is always becoming, basically, yeah.
Thank you. Now, as part of these conversations now about Back to Earth, we often talk about production of reality in a way. And you said before, no, this idea of telling you what to do, this idea of producing reality. You wrote a beautiful text actually for the Remember Nature book called The Environment, Edouard Glissant, and the Poetics of Solidarity, calling kind of for everyone to come to a poetics of solidarity. And towards the end of the film, which I saw, I feel you imply a call of action of some sort. To quote you, whatever I do in this village, I want it to be a metaphor of what is happening in your place, what is happening in somebody else's place. If my work can have an echo with your work, with the work of somebody somewhere else, then we begin to have this new solidarity. Can you talk about this new solidarity and the idea of a production of reality which kind of goes beyond the film?
Yeah. Again, I'm taking it again that from Glissant. Glissant said, in a room like this, at any given time, you have an intuition that you think is proper to you, only belongs to you. No one else in this room knows about it. But Glissant said, but if you share it, you will be surprised that not only in this room, but there are people in Japan, there are people in Mali, in France, who have the same intuition. And if you share it, it will travel and get bigger and bigger. And so if it's about the environment in this sense, your intuition can become a catalyst for some revolution, to do something about the revolution. So your idea can travel, and as knowledge travels, it gets bigger. It becomes more and more important. So this solidarity of intuition was very, very important to Glissant. Of course, he uses it to define something like jazz. You know, jazz, the way people improvise together, they come together. He defined jazz in that way. I try to get some of that in the film I made on him called Edouard Glissant, One World in Relation. But he believed in this notion of knowledge traveling and not keeping your intuition just to yourself. If you have an idea, an intuition of solving a problem, if you share it, you will be surprised that it is being felt by people elsewhere. And therefore, you bring them together. They may be a little different. They may readjust one another, but they can all be used to change the world. But we're not sharing intuition in that sense. And this is what was very important to Glissant, that knowledge travels. And as it travels, it gets bigger, it gets corrected, it gets unpredictable, but nonetheless, it can lead to some kind of revolution.
And the revolution brings us to Angela Davis, because a couple of years ago, we had coffee together, and I asked you, who could be a living author today, because Glissant is a toolbox for both of us and for so many people, but who is a living author today in the 21st century who could, in a similar way to Glissant, be a toolbox? And you immediately answered Angela Davis and said that you're actually making this film with her. In the meanwhile, at that time it was an unrealized project.
Right.
But in the meanwhile, it's actually in big parts realized. You spent 5 days with Angela Davis filming non-stop. Can you tell us about this project? It's a documentary, I suppose, no?
This is a new film I just finished on Angela Davis, A World of Greater Freedom. Angela Davis, again, when I went to the United States, 1973, they had started Black Studies. The first Black Studies started exactly in 1969. And black people in the US began to take over universities and force departments to start departments of black studies. Now, the thinkers of that were Frantz Fanon, Angela Davis, but of course the Du Bois, Frederick Douglass, and so on. And then that Angela Davis, first the image of it, because 73, Angela Davis, she was not only the model for fashion with her afro hair, which I had already admired in Mali and in France, but that Angela Davis was also a thinker because of her relation with the Black Panther movement. But the same Angela Davis became a thinker for the prison industrial complex later on, which is completely post-structuralism and ways of looking at incarceration and how that has generated a whole industry. And then, so I said to Angela, well, it started like this. I said to Angela, whenever I would invite her to New York University to come and give a conference, after she's done, I would say, Angela, it took me to school. One day she started me saying, you always say this. What do you mean by that? I said, well, you taught me this. So, can I make a film on you? She said, okay, if we can find time, let's do it. Because I wanted to do with Angela Davis exactly what I did with Edouard Glissant. That is, who are the new philosophers of our time? Who are the people explaining our world to us today? Philosophy is fine, but can old philosophies explain black people's refusal of the statue that was relegated to them in the United States, for example? How do they change that? So basically, I went to Oakland for 5 days. I interviewed her, and I added that, and then I took some archival footage. And the whole film is really, because what many people do not realize, Angela Davis actually has a PhD from the Frankfurt School in Germany with Adorno, Horkheimer, and Marcuse.
Like Alexander Kluge. Huh?
Exactly. Alexander Kluge was a teaching assistant when Angela Davis was a student, and she laughed. But it's the Angela Davis of the Black Panther movement with the afro hair who is fired from a job from UCLA by Ronald Reagan. That's the Angela Davis that many people know. But this woman, if you look at the genealogy of CRT, critical race, whatever, theory. Yeah. Yeah. So if you look at that, it starts with the Frankfurt School critical theory and how that eventually was used by people in the US in law schools. Of course, the way it is used on television has nothing to do with critical theory. So Angela Davis is trying to explain those kind of things to me, how Adorno say, Angela, you have to criticize everything. And you have to question yourself all the time. So that's the film is basically looking for freedom. And toward the end, Angela actually radically said, yes, black people created a culture in the United States that not only changed the United States, but has changed the world. And it's not only jazz, it's politics and all other kind of things. But blackness is not fixed. The new struggle today, the trans movement, the LGBT movement, are actually the areas that are teaching us the new meanings of freedom. I mean, it's so... I'm sitting there, I say, I told you, Angela, it took me to school, because I'm still thinking that the leaders in black studies are the people who have defined freedom. He said, no, the definition of freedom is elsewhere now. And black people to have to learn freedom from these new areas of, non-binary, gender, and LGBT, and so on. So the film was commissioned by the Sharjah Biennale. So that's what that is.
But it's still being edited, no? For the final.
It is still being edited because the archives, I have archives. Angela Davis talks, for example, about Nina Simone visiting her in prison. And Nina Simone comes with a balloon. And the prison guard said, you can't get in prison with that balloon. And Nina Simone began to scream. So the prison guards were afraid they let her go in. And Angela Davis talked about holding that balloon until all the air went out. So she said, and then she said to me at that moment, she said, what people do not know about Nina Simone is that she's a folk singer. She's doing jazz. She was a trained classical musician, pianist. But women jazz musicians do not allow women to play the piano. So I used, and I tell this long story to say this. I used an archive of Nina Simone singing Mississippi Goddam. Some of you know that song. And Angela Davis said, this is our national anthem. There is Martin Luther King, of course, but Mississippi Goddam is black people's national anthem. Why? Because Nina Simone had asked Angela Davis, can you advise some book titles that I can read? And then Angela said to Nina, you sang this song. That is black national anthem. It's more important than any book you would ever read. So, but buying that archive and getting the right to it, archives, 1 minute can go sometime. If you unknown, like people like us, it could go as high as $12,000 a minute. And if you're more famous, it could even be more expensive. So we're clearing the rights, basically. But it's just a question of time. We're done.
Now, the last question is about your AI project. A couple of years ago, I had a phone call from Gluon, the organization in Belgium, brings together art and science, but this idea, as C.P. Snow lamented, that there is a binary between the humanities on the one hand and then science, on the other hand, and that we need to go beyond this binary.
Right.
And they want to bring artists and scientists together. So I recommended that they should connect you and AI, and the process has been going on again, like with the film you saw tonight. These are all long-term projects. I read an article, actually, you gave me this morning by Dieter Wiczorek about this piece, AI, African Intelligence, and he calls it a return to specific patterns of hermetic knowledge in African culture. To compare African rituals with proceedings of artificial intelligence seems a considerable challenge. Can you tell us about this challenge and about the new work, AI, African Intelligence, which is again produced by L'Université, by Mau Maus in Portugal, Senegal, and Belgium?
Well, first of all, I have to thank you, Hans Ulrich, for connecting me with Arts Electronica in Austria. They have a festival of artificial intelligence every year. So my name was given to them to come and talk about Glissant and artificial intelligence. And I came reluctantly somewhat to talk to them about what Glissant always says, that every time a small culture anywhere dies, it's a part of humanity that dies with it. So an AI actually could eventually contribute to the killing of those parts of humanity that are not that do not fit in the algorithms of artificial intelligence. And they took the challenge seriously, and they asked me to invite some scientists to my studio in Senegal. So I had a physicist, I had somebody who basically is in computer science, and so I invited them to Senegal, and the director of the people who invited me, I have to say his name to give him credit, is Christophe Dejager. He's based in Belgium. So they visited my studio, and when they came back home, they came to me again. Would you make a film on this? Then I wanted to make a film on something again that I don't understand, that I'm trying to understand. This is really why I do things. I'm trying to understand something, so I began to write a book or try to. It's like the opera. When I did the opera in Greece here, I didn't know opera. So I had to learn opera by going to specialists, many people.
To Alexander Kluge.
Alexander Kluge, exactly. So the same thing with AI. So I said, well, what could I do to really be challenged? So I began to look at a ritual of possession in Africa that as a Muslim boy, but Christian boys too, growing up in Africa, they will tell us to stay away from, because it's the devil's practice. People get together and they beat drums and they get possessed and they begin to speak in tongues. So my parents said, you want to stay away from this. So now I say, oh, now that I'm an adult, I can go see this and make a film on it and compare their data and their algorithm to the data and algorithm in computer science and see if they will kind of complement each other, or if it's going to be again the arrival of another electronic, mechanical revolution that comes to Africa, kills Africa, and then impose this universalism. So these were the questions that I approached the film with. And in the process, I learned something about artificial intelligence, and I also learned something about this ritual of possession. But at the same time, by inviting scientists, they too learn something about the ritual of possession. And then we also see how do they keep this memory of possession in their culture. And to our surprise, all the young people from, let's say, 9 to 15, they had the smart telephones filming all the rituals. Every night, we had 5-night performance, 3 times a night, a day, and then you have cell phones. People are filming all the rituals. So it was an incredible discovery for me.
We can look forward to hopefully see this film soon,
Yeah.
And as far as I understand from the research I made on it, it's a labyrinthic kind of movement between what the scientists say and at the same time also you just observing people in the streets and so on. I have a few very last questions. In the meanwhile, we should open it up to your question. We have a microphone.
Can you hear me?
Are there questions? Yeah.
Yes, we'll have the chance to take 1 to 2 questions because we're running late, and then you're all welcome to join us in the restaurant for a reception. Okay, thank you.
Hello, my name is Yanis. First of all, congratulations for your film.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed it, and I must say it was very moving. I have a question regarding you mostly, in regard with the movie. You went back to Africa as a Westerner, although you are African. Now, when you discover your roots and you made the auto-psychoanalysis as we hear in the film, where exactly do you think you stand today? Did you become a new African, or are you a new Westerner?
Well, I'm both 100% African and 100% Westerner. First of all, I'm very, there are values in the West that I will fight for, and there are values that I encounter in Africa that I fight for. So what I was trying to say is this. First of all, I speak more than 3 African languages. I go to Africa every year. I also have an immigrant mentality. We were talking about this. Let's say Ramadan just happened. My relatives in Africa, they say it's Ramadan economic crisis, send some money. So I never stopped being African, but I had a problem. What I think is African had to be questioned. I had to put what you call psychoanalyze. I had to put this into question. I'm completely, I don't know the best way to put it. I have become this kind of person living in limbo between cultures. And I'm not necessarily calling that negative, because I love my life. What I'm trying to say is that there is still another Africa that I need to discover, that this woman in the film and the man, the fisherman, were teaching me. That Africa itself is something very broad. The definition of it will be very different if you leave Dakar and go 25 kilometers from Dakar. Suddenly come to the rural areas, the way the people earn their living every day is so different. Of course, politicians and writers like myself speak in their name, but their concerns are very different. And I was trying to look for these people and what their concerns are. So the Africa as a global identity, I was trying to stay away from that one too. So I never really stopped being African. But I'm saying intellectuals like myself need to look deeper in terms of what is African. This is what I'm saying, not only about myself, but I'm willing to say that about any African intellectual who want to engage in this debate with me. This is what I'm trying to say. And the same is true for somebody who leaves France and goes and spends so many years in the United States and comes back to France as the authentic Frenchman. This is what I'm trying to say. I don't know if I'm clear about this. Yeah.
Thank you, Manthia. And it makes me think, actually, what you just said of a recent conversation I had with Suleiman Bachadiagne, who expresses very similar ideas. Do we have another question?
Can you hear me? Oh, yes.
Yes.
The film was fantastic, and I think you captured beautiful sensibilities from village people. When you start a project, do you have a concept first, or do you experience with your body and then the environment first?
Thank you for the question. So I bought the house in 2010. And I was already taking films every day with my iPhone. And then when these people invited me to make and I had also written a book, which is not published, a novel, which is not published, about this. So when I was asked to make the film, I brought in some professional cameramen to come and help, including my own son, in many ways. How to put together more than the professional images, more than 16 hours, plus the images that I have been taking, because originally I wanted to do an installation. And the Serpentine co-stars, they talked to me, and finally one day they said, "You are a filmmaker, why don't you just make a film?" I said, "Okay, thank you, that's what I was waiting for." So basically, and then when I started making the film, I also try to use the novel that I wrote as voiceover, and it didn't sound well at all. I tried, my editor is a young 27-year-old young man from Bahrain. So at some point, I just told him, I said, "Okay, you leave me in the room, turn off the light, leave your mic on," because I was being very self-conscious and I wanted to sound really smart. So I told him to leave, turn off the light, and I started talking to myself and remembering all these images that I had filmed. So it's not a written voiceover. It's really, I just start talking in the dark to myself about what I want to say. That's what you get in the film. And then I give him that, and then we already have the assembly of the images and how things, the chronology of things. We switched them, we put things here and there, but we had a kind of logging going. So that's how I put the film together. Really, again, very Glissant. I began to listen to my own intuition, be as simple as possible, and say, just talk to these images. They can hear you. Just talk to them, and I keep talking to them. That's basically what I did. Filmmakers, and there are some filmmakers in the room here, they will see right away the problems with that and the advantage with that. They will see that right away, because my teacher was Jean Rouge, and he was a master for, kind of master voiceover kind of person, and a little poetic, but to just sit in the dark and talk to the images, I think being with the woman in the village actually taught me how to do that, that those images have soul, they have everything. If you talk to them, they will respond to you. That's what I try to do.
Thanks for these two questions. In French, one says jamais deux sans trois, so we can take a third question.
Jamais deux sans trois.
Is there a third
yes.
question or comment?
Greetings, Mr. Diawara.
Hello.
Thank you very much for the beautiful movie and the lecture, small lecture that you gave us. We have a question about the person that you're referring to all the time. We know about Frantz Fanon, but the other name you're talking about, we have to check. Edouard
Glissant.
Glissant, yes. The first time I hear about him, and what he said is amazing. It's the first time that I come in contact with. My question is about you and about us. We are kids with African parents born in Greece or raised in Greece, and we have never. Some of us have never been back. I came when I was 3 years old in Greece. Now I have the Greek identity. I went to the Greek army. I've never been back, and I never felt the need to go back like you do. And when they ask me, my Greek friends ask me, why don't you want to go back? I tell them I try to explain it like countries are like ships. They're sailing in the sea of time, and anytime I go back, I'm not going back to the same country, exactly what you said before.
Uh-huh.
And my question to you is that because we always have quarrel with the previous generation, do you think that it's something weird that we don't feel so much the need to return like you did? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that it's similar to the question the gentleman asked back there to me. It is similar in a sense that I think that you are 100% Greek, and you are also, you also, in my case, I feel 100% African, and I was born and raised there. It's different. I was in Mali until maybe 17, 18, and in Mali, when you are that age, you dream of going to France. You have to go to Paris. So you read your Arthur Rimbaud, your Mallarmé, and so on. You want to go to Paris. But I had discovered two things at the same time. One was Rimbaud, Baudelaire. The other one was James Brown. So in many ways, this is really my identity. That keeps changing and changing, but really I'm going back to music, I'm going back to poetry, until I met Glissant or Fanon, as you well mentioned it. I think that the desire for Africa will come, if it's not there now, I think it will come. Because every time I go to Africa, I see all the misery that you're talking about, but I see beautiful things. I see things that we have lost in the West. You know, particularly when it comes to humanity. When it comes to humanity, when it comes to solidarity, when it comes to people really, paying attention to, Glissant says this all the time, and we talk about this. He says, rien n'est vrai, tout est vivant. Rien n'est vrai, tout est vivant. nothing is true. My translation is going to be very bad, so some of the French speakers, please correct this. But what matters is the living. Life is what matters most. And in Africa, you can see the preciousness of life and identify with it. I don't want to be too essentialist about this. If you look at the United States, you are a Greek, if you want to call it African. We're very happy when you see a Greek player in the NBA. We all say Africa, is African, or Nigerian player. Or this. So your need of Africa, if it's not there now, don't worry too much about it. It's gonna come when you least expect it. It will come, and I can assure you of that. Thank you. Yeah.
So thank you so much for these 3 questions and three answers. I did make a promise that tonight is not going to be a marathon. As you know, we've done 2 Serpentine marathons before in Greece, but I do have a last question, Manthia,
forgot about that.
which I have to ask you, because we wanted originally I started to do a kind of a Proustian questionnaire, and the idea is that each time, the artist adds a question, and let's not do the questionnaire because I think we don't have time, but let's do the last question you added to the questionnaire, question number 42. You wrote earlier in the cafe here in the museum, what is a relational identity? And I wanted to ask you about that, but also about my favorite book of Edouard Glissant, which is all about relational identity, which is Sartorius, which is, for those of you, it's obvious that there need to be more translation of Glissant to Greek, but this is a really important novel he wrote in 1991 about the utopian party to people deriving identity not from a genealogy, but from a constant exchange. So what is a relational identity?
Glissant defines, well, first, it's Sartorius. Glissant, art for Glissant. What is art? First, we are in Greece. This is important. Art, if you look at the poetry, is that which was taken in the cave, in Plato's cave, that which was taken away because it's too indistinct, it's not clear, it's not precise, it's not transparent. So it was eliminated from the discussion of the Republic in many ways. And for Glissant, art is that which makes us tremble. We not only tremble with nature, but we tremble with the trembling of other people. We quiver with them. We don't come to them in a very decisive, decided manner. Mancha, you from Mali, your name is Diawara. The Diawaras were like this. And then I say, yes. He said, therefore I know you. Glissant will say, no, you don't know me. You don't know yourself, let alone knowing the other person. He said, the anthropologists do that. Identity is always complex. Identity is something that's always becoming. So this trembling that we see in novels like Sartorius is very, very important to Glissant. The relational identity, Glissant, when he talks about it, he is French. In French, everybody is equal in the Republic. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. Your identity is defined by the Republic. So don't talk to me about your African identity or your Portuguese identity. You are Français tout court. And in the United States, my other culture, you are defined by your group. Black American, Italian American, Greek American, you know these things. So people like myself, we are in between these two groups. French people say, oh, the problem with Americans is that they talk about identity, identity, identity. What is this? It's racist. And then you go to America, they say, oh yeah, French people say, oh, we're not racist at all. But at the same time, black people, Algerians, all the people are always at the bottom. What is that? How do they explain that if they're not racist? How come only white people are always at the top? So these two cultures are attacking one another. And for Glissant, identity is actually relational. It's not something fixed. So the French people were uneasy with Glissant because they love Glissant. He's not Frantz Fanon, and yet he's still talking about identity. You know, he said it's a relational identity. It's not a fixed identity, but it's relational. It's something that always becomes. When two differences come together, they produce a third one, and so on, and keep going, and it's unpredictable. So how does Glissant define relation? He said it's that which links two differences together, that which relates them, and so relate in that sense is connecting them, and that which French word is relater, that is relay, but relay meaning telling the story, and then the other relay, like in the Olympics, in Greece again, where I have the baton and I run and I give to the person in front of me, and that person runs and gives it to another person. So relation is defined by all these four elements. Relier, relayer, relater, and I think aussi, relier, there is a fourth one like that. But he said all the elements of relation are equal. So all the differences that come together, they may be small, some may be big, but they are all equal. Because what you don't realize that when you meet me, something of you stays with me. I may not pay attention to it today, but 10 days later, 10 years later, suddenly I will stop in my quotidian and say, oh yeah, so-and-so said this. Or when I met so-and-so, I noticed something. Suddenly it becomes important, what Glissant called l'imaginaire, you know. So it's that relationality that's very important to Glissant, that all the elements are the visible and the invisible, the small and the large, they are all coming together, and as they come together, they are influencing one another, either right away or later, and identity is like that. This is very important to him.
There could not be a better conclusion, Manthia. Thank you so much. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt. Brother, you're the man. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Another big round of applause for Manthia Diawara.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.